Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this very special session in our series of Stronger Together Fighting to End Jew Hatred Conference lead-in events. The Stronger Together Fighting to End Jew Hatred Conference is taking place on Sunday, September 10th, 2023 at the Bayit Synagogue in Thornhill, Ontario from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. This collaborative conference involves an unprecedented number of Jewish organizations and non-Jewish allies working together to provide advocacy strategies for Jewish and non-Jewish students, educators, community members, professionals, and policymakers to counter the epidemic of Jew hatred sweeping Canada and the world. With key speakers like Brooke Goldstein, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, Hannah Alper, and Luke Helton, as well as sessions developed by organizations such as CAEF, End Jew Hatred, the Lawfare Project, UJA's Israel Engagement Department, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, CEJA, UJA Genesis, Stand With Us Canada, and Allied Voices for Israel, we are showing the GTA, Canada, and the world that in the fight against Jew hatred, we are truly stronger together. In order to bring this type of event to you, we need your help. Please go to the website at strongertogether.co.il and register for the event. And if you're in a position to do so, consider making a donation so that we can make this conference accessible to as many people as possible. You'll receive a tax receipt for your donation and the satisfaction of knowing that you're making a direct impact in the ongoing battle to end Jew hatred. My name is Rabbi Corey Margulies, and I'm the founder and president of jteach.ca, an organization dedicated to providing education in regards to anti-Semitism and Holocaust studies. I'm also the principal of jteach Academy, a supplemental private school opening this September, providing high school courses through a lens of Jewish and Israel advocacy, and offering the first high school course in Canada focused on the Holocaust, grade 11 Holocaust studies. It's my honor to be moderating our esteemed panel of journalists this evening. Tonight, we're joined by three recognized professionals in their field who are no strangers to taking a stance when it comes to identifying acts of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. Each of them has demonstrated through their words on numerous occasions that silence in the face of hatred and discrimination is unacceptable, and we can only hope that those in mainstream media who turn a blind eye to acts of Jew hatred will wake up and follow their lead. Barbara Kay has been an opinion columnist for the National Post since 2003. She also writes a regular column for the Epoch Times. Barbara is the author and co-author of 4 books and is on the advisory board of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, a pro-Israel think tank established in 1988. A 2-time Investigating Reporting Award winner and 9-time winner of the Toronto Sun's Reader's Choice Award for news writer, Sue Ann Levy made her name advocating for the poor, the homeless, the elderly, and for fighting against the striking rise in anti-Semitism in the BDS movement across Canada. Sue Ann is also currently a freelancer for True North. Terry Glavin is a national and international affairs columnist for the Ottawa Citizen and the National Post, and a senior fellow with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. His assignments have included Israel, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. He's won more than a dozen literary and journalism awards, including the BC Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence. I welcome all 3 of you, and I thank you and appreciate your being here tonight to speak with us. We're going to start off with some comments from our panelists. And Barbara, I'm going to call on you first and put you on the spot. So please, the mic is yours.
Thanks very much, Rabbi Margulies. And it's an honor to be here, especially in the company of 2 journalists that I admire greatly. And I know that we're talking about anti-Semitism in general, but I don't think in the media, certainly not in the Canadian media, you will ever find any media person who will display outward anti-Semitism of the kind like "I hate Jews." Anti-Semitism in the media is generally focused on criticism of or demonization of Israel and Zionism. So that's that's my subject for my panel contribution. So there's no better lead on the subject of media bias on Israel today than CNN's international anchor, Christiane Amanpour, who was publicly forced to publicly apologize for her April 10th reference to the murder of members of the D family in Israel, Rabbi Leo D's wife and daughters, as, quote, killed in a shootout, with no mention of the fact that their killers were terrorists and that they were randomly selected civilians. Amanpour corrected it to a shooting, but only after threat of a $1.3 billion lawsuit and a 10-day campaign to force a correction by the indispensable Israel media watch group Honest Reporting. As CNN dithered, Honest Reporting took its case to the people, with more than 1 million people seeing their demand for an apology as well as their petition on social media. Honest Reporting writes that their content this year alone has reached 18 million people. So this rare victory for factual over biased reporting should be especially cherished because Amanpour's huge celebrity and reputation for trustworthiness makes her widely distributed apology punch above a normal retraction's weight. We are long past the point where we can assume that historical ignorance on the part of journalists and their editors is the basis of media bias against Israel. We now understand that it is willful bias and ideologically based. The sort of bias against Israel exhibited by the likes of Amanpour is routine in just about everything that is produced by even the slightly left-leaning media. Progressive journalists express no shame in that fact. Rather, they justify it as a necessity in achieving social justice, which today's progressive journalists perceive as a more noble mission than the now embattled norm of evidence-produced reporting, which is characterized by the reporting of my colleagues here tonight. Under social justice rubrics, Israel is the colonialist oppressor, the Palestinians are the indigenous oppressed, period, no discussion. For example, last May, 33 CBC journalists signed on to an open letter, along with 1,600 other signatories, proposing that Canadian newsrooms abandon a neutral view when covering the Middle East and urging newsrooms to adopt a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel position instead. This contravened stated CBC policy. Nevertheless, when Honest Reporting complained to the CBC that 2 of the signatory journalists were still covering Israel with bias, they were informed that the policy would not be enforced. According to Honest Reporting Canada's CEO, Mike Fagelman, CBC is by far the most culpable for unbalanced reporting on Israel of all Canadian news outlets. He ranked Radio Canada, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and CTV as 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, respectively. Over 2 decades, Honest Reporting has issued approximately 1,750 complaints to the CBC for misreportage on Israel. About 70% of those that misinformation is corrected, but unlike in the Amanpour case, the corrections go unnoticed. I'm emphasizing Canada, of course, but it goes without saying that media bias against Israel is pandemic in Europe, Scandinavia, and Britain. For a typical example, one of hundreds, thousands, according to Simon Wiesenthal Center CEO Marvin Heyer, the BBC falsely reported that a recent victim of violence on a bus voiced an anti-Muslim slur. But what was actually heard on tape was a distressed Jew speaking in Hebrew and appealing for help. Despite this audio evidence, the BBC has refused to correct its report. The Simon Wiesenthal Center also pointed to a scandal involving a former BBC journalist who was caught tweeting statements like, "Hitler was right." There are 1,000 such examples available to anyone who cares to do a cursory search. Nobody has done more to expose media bias against Israel, with an emphasis on the Associated Press, for whom he worked from 2006 to 2011, than American-Israeli journalist Matti Friedman. In 2014, following the Gaza-Israel conflict known as Operation Protective Edge, Friedman wrote a feature article for The Atlantic magazine titled, "What the Media Gets Wrong About Israel." His thesis, still valid, even more so, is that no matter what the actual story is where Israel is concerned, quote, most reporters in Gaza believe that their job is to document violence directed by Israel at Palestinian civilians. That is the essence of the Israel story. Friedman's personal observations from his tenure at Associated Press are revealing. During those 5 years, there were 40 staffers covering Israel and the Palestinian territories. That's more than in China, Russia, India, the Arab Spring countries, and all 50 sub-Saharan African countries combined. In all of 2013, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict claimed 42 lives, which is about the monthly homicide rate at Chicago. In fact, Jerusalem had fewer violent deaths in 2013 than Portland, Oregon. Exactly one stringer covered from Associated Press covered Syria before the Syrian civil war began, even though 190,000 lives had been lost in Syrian violence in the previous 3 years, more than in Israel-Arab conflicts over the last century. This is something Terry Glavin knows a lot about because he knows more about Syria than any other investigative journalist in Canada. Friedman says Associated Press staffers in Israel quickly learned the publishing rules. Corruption in the Palestinian Authority, the bureau chief told Friedman that was, quote, not the story. Israeli corruption, cover it. In one 7-week period, there were 27 stories on the, quote, moral failings of Israeli society, higher than Associated Press's total number of critical stories about Palestinian society, including Hamas, for the preceding 3 years. Arab hatred of Jews is not the story. Jewish hatred of Arabs is. A 2009 peace proposal from the Israeli prime minister to the Palestinian president was not permitted to be reported at all, Friedman said. Hamas censors what on-site reporters can write and photograph. They obey because they are, justifiably, scared of reprisals if they flout Hamas's warnings. The American historian Richard Landes, a scholar of millenarian movements, has just published an important book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong?, which describes the collapse of journalistic standards where Israel is concerned into what he calls lethal journalism, which Landis defines as, quote, when you pass on the promotional war propaganda of your enemy as news. 2 blood libels against Israel, the staged Mohammed al-Jura affair during the 2000 Intifada and the so-called 2002 Jenin massacre, were pivotal in permanently erasing any Israeli moral high ground whatsoever. Landis's book's title reprises a statement by Kofi Annan, who was then the UN Secretary General, who said he couldn't believe the whole world could be wrong when Israel denied that any massacre had taken place in Jenin. As it turned out, of course, there was no massacre at all. As it turned out, also, the whole world was wrong then and continues to be where Israel is concerned. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barbara. We appreciate that. Okay, we're going to move on to Sue-Ann. Please, share with us what's on your mind about this very serious topic.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. And I'm going to take it one step further than what Barbara said about standards with respect to Israel in journalism. Well, standards have been lowered all across the board, whether it is in politics, whether it is journalism is on the decline, and it's very sad to see. I'm going to talk more about what I've observed from my so-called investigative and street reporting, mostly related to Toronto. It's interesting that this afternoon on social media, which I'm a very active participant on, the teachers' unions were going kind of batshit crazy about York Catholic Board choosing not to raise the gay flag at their education center during Pride Month. And, one of the teachers' unions tweeted that there's an increasing and escalating period or characterization of hate towards trans people, hate towards LGBTQRS I lose track of all the initials, but there's an epidemic of hate. And I tweeted back, well, I'm sorry to say this, but as an openly gay woman who's also Jewish, I've experienced far more anti-Semitism and very, very personal attacks as a Jewish woman than I ever have as an openly gay woman married to another woman. And I'm talking about in Toronto. I first got started in covering, well, anti-Semitism in a really, really obsessive, almost zealous way when the queers against Israeli apartheid marched in the Pride Parade way back in 2009. And I and others worked for 5 years to get them out of the parade. But as evidence of the indoctrination of young people, radically left gays, most of them who were there marching for Israeli queers against Israeli apartheid had no clue what they were marching for, had never been to Israel, had no idea what apartheid was or whether it applied to Israel, which it did not. And if you suggested and gave them facts, they accused you of pinkwashing. So this was the start in my mind of, the rabid anti-Semitism from the radical left. Now, a lot of people would like to say that to me, and I get away with a little bit because I'm conservative but gay, so one cancels each other out on the oppression scale. But people like to say that all the anti-Semitism is coming from the right wing, that it's neo-Nazis, white supremacists, which they do look at Jews as many, many times, white privileged people. But I find as of late that it has infiltrated the radical left. The teachers' unions, the labor unions, the school system, whether it's the Toronto school system or many other school systems around Ontario, the radical left people are obsessed, almost obsessed, and have been indoctrinated. Young teachers who have no clue what they're talking about are obsessed with this idea that Israel is, as Barbara said, a colonial state, that it's full of people who are white and privileged. They don't even know that Israel contains a melting pot of different racial makeups and ethnicities, but they just fixate on this colonialist, white privileged, and it's really anti-Semitic. So my other experience, besides Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, well, there were two, was food vendors in downtown Toronto. The crazy lady who was on Instagram, she's been put out of business, by the way, thanks to me and others, who was posting on Instagram that she would not welcome Zionists into her catering store in West End, Toronto. Well, I went to her shop when I first covered it, the whole issue, and I did many, many stories on her. And I walked in, picked up a salad, put it on the counter, and I said, I am so-and-so, and I'm a Zionist. Do you want me to buy this salad? Will you, sell me the salad? And of course she wanted the money, but then she promptly threw me out of the store. So she, I guess she is the epitome of, if you're woke, you go broke, because she pushed the whole notion that Israel was an apartheid state. She was openly and virulently anti-Semitic on social media, and she got pushed out of business. Everybody started to disassociate themselves from her. The only thing is that she had a very large, and this is the scary thing, this is the really terrifying thing, being a journalist who, tries to expose this sort of stuff, is that she has some very dangerous people who follow her. And while she never tried to sue me, for the last 6 months of my time at the Sun, they actually harassed me and signed me up for all sorts of online platforms. And I kept getting calls from different people saying that I wanted to buy their online platforms. And this is her form of harassment. So they're not nice people. I also revealed the whole story of Javier Davila, who produced 2 anti-Israel manuals for the Toronto District School Board. And the guy still has his job to this day. He's openly anti-Israel. He did it during the last insurrection. And I had, and this is what happens with these people, and these are the unionists, I had a petition started about me that I was evil, that I didn't know what I was talking about. They attacked my integrity, and they had 5,000 signatures on this petition. I complained to the board. The board would do nothing about it. It brings me to school boards. And I talked to the rabbi about this. Right now, they are teaching what's called critical race theory, which they dress in the guise of anti-Black racism. So what they do with critical race theory is they teach that white people are oppressors and Black people are the oppressed. And of course, Jews fall into the category of oppressors because we're considered privileged and white supremacists and all that jazz. And I think this has given rise, unfortunately, to increased anti-Semitism at the Toronto School Board, at the Ottawa School Board. I see that Lisa Leviton is on this call. We've, changed emails about some of the anti-Semitism in the Ottawa School Board. It's like, get them while they're young and indoctrinate them. So it's not just in universities anymore. It's not just the BDS movement is not just in universities, but it's in the school boards at a very, very young age. And it's sickening. It's obscene to see. And I'm going to stop there for now.
Thank you, Sue-Ann. Yeah, some of us that are present here were at a meeting the other day, a town hall, and I actually made the comment that we really need to start addressing this issue at the elementary and secondary school level. There are great efforts to do so in post-secondary institutions because we've seen terrible anti-Semitism bloom there. But we really are not seeing as much recognition of what's occurring in our secondary schools and even in our elementary schools. So we really need to institute plans and initialize action to correct that behavior and correct that wrong perception of Jews in Israel in our young people who are the leaders of our future. So thank you. I'm going to turn things over to Terry right now. Terry, please share your thoughts, and then we'll move on to, I have a couple of questions that I'll pose to the 3 of you, but we'll move on for the most part to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was lovely hearing Barbara and Sue-Ann. I'm going to make a bit of a boast. Matty Friedman is actually a Canadian Israeli. He's not an American Israeli, Barbara.
Oh, sorry. I should.
My only objection
Yes,
to what
you're
you have
right.
said. Matty's great. Yeah, I come at this from, I've been around the block, and I come at this from the point of view of a journalist who covers foreign affairs, international policy, international human rights. And I also come from the left, and I think that tends to inform the way I apprehend this phenomenon of left anti-Semitism, irrational, hysterical anti-Zionism. My friend Ben Cohen used to be the editor of Z-Word, or Z-Word as the Americans would say, wrote a book called Some of My Best Friends, and introduced the concept of bistro anti-Semitism as opposed to beer keller anti-Semitism. And I think people will know exactly what I mean when I use those terms. And also informed by the work of David Hirsch in Britain. The British left is far more advanced, I think, far more advanced than the left in Canada in identifying some of these toxic currents that have been flowing through the capillaries of fashionable culture, the sort of the avant-garde, the radical chic elements of the establishment. Canada is a peculiar case in many ways in that we have a kind of progressive tradition of nationalism in Canada, to the extent that Canadian nationalists historically were people of the left who made a very reasonable case that Canadians needed a sovereign country, a place to have independent conversations of our own and to sort ourselves out, and which is a difficult thing to do when you're strung out across the top of the most dynamic cultural dynamo in the history of nation states. And being a Canadian, you're a citizen of a country that's a decentralized constitutional monarchy that's also bilingual and has a shaky understanding of who it is, what it is as a country. But that kind of an anti-Americanism, I think, evolved after the 1960s, particularly after the 1967 war that Israel fought and defended itself and won, which it will never be forgiven for doing. And it's a kind of the way Israel is intended to serve as a kind of surrogate for the United States. Jews are intended to serve as these sort of objectionable surrogates of Israel. And I come to this because of the kind of company I keep. I hang out with a lot of Iranians and Afghans and Syrians. And I noticed this very early on after 9/11. Something about 9/11 was a real, I think, it's like a blunt trauma wound to the head. And the left didn't know what to make of it. The very idea that there could be forces in the world more evil than George Bush, came as a bit of a surprise, I think, to a lot of people. And so they relied on Noam Chomsky to tell them that 9/11, it didn't really matter who the perpetrators were, that this was kind of a interesting event in that now we have license to demonstrate the wickedness of Israel and to show how Israel is the primary source of discomfort and disturbance in the greater Middle East. So among my Afghan friends, I couldn't count anyone who opposed the NATO UN intervention after 9/11. Everybody was troops in. And they were, liberals, intellectuals, lefty type people. But among all my, shall I say, white friends, they were all troops out. And those were also people ostensibly of the left. And I thought, well, this is quite peculiar. And among my Iranian friends too, I began to hear a great degree of disaffection in that it was impossible to have reasonable conversations about Iran, about the vicious oppression of the Khomeinist regime, without somebody interjecting by saying, well, of course, you sound just like an American Republican. And organizationally too, what I began to notice is in the so-called anti-war movement, there were a series of conferences beginning in 2002 in Cairo that brought together the Canadian Peace Alliance, the Vancouver Coalition to Stop the War, the Toronto Stop the War Coalition, with the leaders of Hezbollah, Hamas, PFLP General Command, the Iraqi Ba'athist Party, the Syrian Ba'athist Party, and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, interestingly, and significantly. And I found it all quite astounding that what united all of these currents was something that we would have recognized, certainly in my parents' generation, as a drooling anti-Semitism, and an absolutely hoarse-voiced and deranged antipathy towards Israel. And so that's sort of been my interest in how that has evolved and developed. And I think Canada is kind of unique in this way, and that these currents that, I mean, the way I would prefer to put it, and I'll be happy to be challenged on this, I may be wrong, but there is a phenomenon that has come to sort of occupies all the places where the left used to be. I'll put it that way. And people may argue, well, you know, the left has always been a little bit dodgy on these things. Fine. But it's that phenomenon that has preoccupied my attentions, and I haven't really. I mean, it's just unavoidable. I think is that, and it is very much an establishment phenomenon. It's very much a phenomenon of the bourgeoisie, the avant-garde. That in Canada, for instance, you can have. People may be familiar with the case of Laith Marouf. Last summer, this character who is, I mean, I can't even describe this. You can't exaggerate the anti-Semitism that this person has. He's been an absolute font, a fountain of this horrible rhetoric. He's always been this. He's never been anything except a drooling anti-Semite. And he's, of course, pro-Assad, and, you know, he has no difficulty with the Khomeini regime. And it is discovered that he has been given an amount of money, I think it was $125,000, to lecture Canadian journalists in the among federally regulated broadcasters in how to be not racist. And it's somehow this escaped everyone's notice. And in fact, there's actually nothing else to notice about this person going back 20 years. And as it turns out, the more I dug, and a couple of other journalists, several $100,000 over the years he's managed to obtain from the federal government for various consultative purposes. And there's something that's kind of, it's normal, it's normalized, this kind of, you know, if we're not allowed, if it's not anti-Semitism, I'd like to know what the term is. This is what I keep saying. Oh, well, people say, oh, it's not anti-Semitic. Well, what is it? Give me the term, give me the word. That it has really become kind of normalized in Canada among a certain strata of the radical chic, the avant-garde, and the Liberal Party, I regret to say. And it's not so much in acts of commission, although there's certainly there's a certain surfeit of that sort of thing. It's the acts of omission, things that are just overlooked, not mentioned. And this is true of the media. I last summer embarked upon an investigation, was published in a huge package in the National Post, about an organization called Samadoun, which is openly a front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has been associated with the most hideous and violent rhetoric about the necessity of reviving an intifada, doesn't believe there should be a terrorist list in Canada, let alone one that contains the PFLP or Hezbollah or Hamas. 3 days after the Israeli authorities listed Samadoun specifically as a terrorist entity in its own right, rather than just because of its association with the PFLP, Canada granted Samadoun official status under the Nonprofit Corporations Registry, under the Nonprofit Corporations Act, so they can raise money in Canada. And they've had a number of public events. In fact, just about a month ago in Ottawa, there was another international conference that this persistent notion of the Jews as an occupying, illegitimate, white racist settler state in Palestine, totally rejecting the indigeneity of the Jews in the Holy Land, and characterizing the Palestinian struggle as, of course, from the river to the sea, completely eliminationist, by any means necessary, whatever violence you like, and identifies with, or attempts to identify with, other legitimate you might say, national liberation struggles around the world, who tended to greet Samadoun with, thanks but no thanks, and with Indigenous people in Canada as well. And so there is a kind of an idea, what Shulamit Volkov calls a kind of an ideational package. It's hard to really call it an ideology because it's just a melange of awful ideas and cliches. But there really is an ideational package that accommodates the most belligerent and vicious forms of misogyny and anti-Semitism, if it can take on or purport to take on an Islamic tone, completely fine. It's just sort of expected. Well, that's just the way Arabs are. And a deliberate, I think, deliberate overlooking of Jew hatred in its modern form. Not just Judenrein, but Judenstaatsrein in Canada. And it really is, it's a small town. I think the number of journalists who are paying attention to this stuff, I've got my beat, there's a lot going on right now. Chinese foreign interference, and I haven't even got around to noticing the implications of the Arab League accepting Bashar Assad back into that rancid brotherhood. But it's kind of a small town, the number of journalists who pay attention or even notice this. And God help you, speak out loud about it.
Thank you, Terry. I think as I was listening to the three of you speak, there was certain patterns that seemed to be emerging. I mean, one of those things we spoke about, or that you spoke about, has to do with this new, what they call, I know, Terry, you're saying it replaces the left way of thinking, and Sue-Ann and Barbara were indicating that it is a left perception that Jews are part of the oppressors. Jews are colonialists. We're being labeled as something other than what we really are, and that is they're trying to put us in this neat package, this tight little box where we can be identified and insulted and discriminated against at will because we just fit this wrongness that's been developed somehow by some people. We see, Laith Maruth is the most recent famous case of a misrepresentation of an anti-racist educator who's virulently anti-Semitic. We see constantly in the school systems and government where they're bringing in these so-called anti-racism experts who seem to feel that it's okay to denigrate Israel and put them in a position, and the Jews and make no mistake, when people are addressing Israel as a villain, they're talking about the Jewish people. Half the world's Jewish population lives in Israel. So, and you can't tell specifically who is and who isn't. I myself happen to be Israeli, and people wouldn't take me as that necessarily, but I certainly stand by that. I'm definitely a proud Canadian, although sometimes that's tested. And I'm also a proud Israeli, which is also tested at times. But I'm not against Israel or Canada for arbitrary reasons. They're for specific reasons, and it's attached to specific policies, which brings us to people's objection to IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And we've faced, as member countries that have signed on to IRA, organizations, municipalities, provincial government, we've all signed on and accepted this as a guiding definition of anti-Semitism. Canada, Ontario, York Region, TDSB, there are definitely organizations that have deemed that it's accepted. But when it comes to implementation, we have a problem because people create objections, just as they do in other areas, that don't exist. That criticizing Israel in any way, shape, or form is going to be deemed anti-Semitic when IRA specifically designates under certain conditions, it can be deemed anti-Semitic. So my question, my very long-winded question to the three of you, really has something to do with IRA being a guiding definition of anti-Semitism. What do you think it would take for organizations to be obligated to follow that definition, especially and in particular organizations that are either supported, sponsored, or part of our government organizations who have stated that they accept IRA as our guiding definition of anti-Semitism?
Shall I say something? Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm actually a little conflicted about the IRA definition. I think it's a good definition because it makes very clear that criticism of Israel is not the issue, but demonization of Israel is. And anybody that doesn't know the difference between criticism and demonization is somebody who's playing games in order to get out of having to give up the right to demonize Israel. And that's what they do want. The problem with definitions is the more precise it gets, then the more people learn how to do an end run around them. So to get to where they want to go, but they know the minefield that they have to run through. And the more you try to pin something down, the more elusive it becomes. One of the problems I have with IRA, not with IRA per se, but is I'm very conscious of the fact that there is a strong movement in Canada. You remember the kerfuffle over the motion 103, which attempted to have a definition of Islamophobia, or excuse me, a day honoring or commemorating or whatever, marking Islamophobia, but they refused. That was the opposite thing. Instead of spending 7 years, as the IRA people did, trying to come up with a precise definition, the Islamophobia activists have done everything they can not to define it, because their objective is to get a blasphemy law in place. Because when you do pin them down, the few that will admit, that are honest about it, they will say, yes, Islamophobia is a fear or hatred of Islam or Muslims. So they're not talking about a state or Pakistan or something like that. They want a blasphemy law that has, there's been a movement to get this law in place all over the world, began at the time of Durban. I know Terry knows all about it, and I don't want to go into all the details of it, but this is a very pernicious attempt to stifle any discussion of Islamism, of jihadism, of the kind of rhetoric that is we hear in the demonization of Israel. That's part of the Hamas charter, all of that. So I don't want to get long-winded about it, but I'll just say that I'm a bit conflicted about any definition of a precise kind of hatred, because I think we all know, it's like, the judge who didn't know what obscene art was, but he knew it when he saw it. And I think that all reasonable people know the difference between criticism and hatred. And so I'm a little conflicted myself.
I'm not so conflicted. I think it gives a benchmark, and it's certainly given me the courage over the last 5 years to call out the obsession with Israel, the criticism of Israel, while ignoring human rights abuses in China, in Syria, in Uganda, and all these places where the human rights abuses, I would dare say, are far worse. And it's given me the courage to say, well, this is just pure anti-Semitism. And I've seen a lot of it. I've seen the obsession. And I'll give you 2 examples. When the Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, burst their way into the parade for 5 years, we would say, and I would say to some of them, and others would say, well, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East that accepts homosexuality, that is, has open arms, that people leave the Mideast states to go to Israel, and you can my wife and I almost adopted a child from Israel. So you can adopt, you can, get married, whatever. And you'd be thrown off a building in some of the Arab states. You'd have your fingers chopped off, that kind of thing. And the activists would say, details, details. They didn't want to hear. They were in total denial. So all they wanted to do
Well,
is
they said Israel was pinkwashing
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to further their agenda. So I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So the IHRA, I think, has the Euro definition has provided a framework whereby I can call out people who have this obsession, and I've noticed here in the chat that there's a lot of comment about social media. And, a lot of the haters find their way onto social media. They, they're sort of like cockroaches who hang out in social media and hit you when you least expect it. But the other example I want to give to you is Al-Quds. Al-Quds Day in Toronto.
Good.
I have worked for years as a journalist to try and get that evil, hateful rally, protest off the streets of Toronto. Well, Terry, you alluded to, why this continues, and it's because politicians have no spine. They have no spine, and, you have the era definition, but the police will not call out hate for what it is. The politicians will not call out hate for what it is. They pay lip service to it. Meanwhile, these ugly, awful, hateful people march up and down the streets of downtown Toronto. And I've been at many of those parades, put myself in the middle of them and been shouted out myself. I actually love it because I can stand there and look them in the eye. But, that's the thing. You've got these definitions, but nobody wants to act. The police don't act. Politicians don't want
But
to act.
Sue-Ann, we have a law against an incitement to hatred law.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yes.
they are contravening that law in Al-Quds.
Exactly.
You don't need the era definition to tell a policeman, hey, isn't this against there's a criminal law for incitement to hatred. Don't you see what's happening here? If they had the spine, they wouldn't need the era definition. They would act on the laws we already have.
But they don't. And
well, listen,
they're
Nazi Germany had laws against hate speech. And in fact, sometimes people actually won lawsuits. Individuals did. It's not laws alone are not enough to stop hatred. You need a zeitgeist that allows hatred to flourish. And when everybody is silent because they understand the rules of the game, which is what happened with Laith Marouf, and we all know, and by the way, not a single head rolled. In the old days, somebody would have resigned, a deputy minister or somebody, nothing, zero. I mean, this government's chutzpah during all their scandals, never mind just the anti-Semitic ones, is something for the history books to really look at and marvel at. But
I think it's a struggle that has to be waged. I think you have to fight this one. It's not a hill to die on, but it's you got to defend IRA and you've got to push it. But I also agree. I agree. I am conflicted as well in this. I think in the same kind of way that Barbara is. Like politics and law is downstream of culture, and we don't have a culture. I mean, one of the more absurd things about the whole Laith Marouf business was the remedy was that I think was it not CIJA and maybe the Simon Wiesenthal Center was asked to sort of supply people who can teach public servants what anti-Semitism is, so that this might not happen again. I don't know what to say. What kind of a definition, a legalistic definition of anti-Semitism would one need? to be able to fail to recognize what they were seeing and hearing from this guy. But yeah, I think it's kind of telling that all of this effort has to go into a very consensus building has to go into this effort to say, this is what anti-Semitism is. You know, after everything that the 20th century taught us, you would think we'd have kind of an inkling by now.
Kind of, yeah.
So yeah, I'm kind
Well-
of conflicted for similar reasons, I think.
Well, I'm going to just say that, and maybe you'll hate me for saying this, but we are ourselves, our own community is at fault as well for not speaking up loudly
Oh,
enough.
yeah. Useful
And-
Judiots, useful Judiots.
Useful idiots, and I've seen many of them. The ones who join the hate groups at the end of the Walk with Israel, the
Mhm.
ones who were at Queen's Park when I used to cover the B'nai B'rith crimes report, the hate incidents report, the useful idiots, the people who bury their heads and are in total denial, the people who were shocked 2 years ago when some of these creepy people were roaming through their community trying to harass them. The people who were shocked when this other creepy guy from Mississauga, I can't remember his name, but this Arab sympathizer or terrorist sympathizer was hounding them in parks in the Bathurst Manor area, and people are shocked. Well, I never thought this could happen to me. I mean, I've seen it building over the years, and nobody spoke up. Very few people spoke up.
Right. I think it's often telling. It's as much about those who oppose IRA as those who do not accept it. Those who vehemently oppose it, it says something about their character that they're absolutely refuse and try to counter an attempt to put out a common definition, a starting point to identifying and addressing anti-Semitism. And that's how I see it. That's what it is. It's a guiding definition. It gives us a framework by which we can identify whether words or actions are anti-Semitic or not. It's obviously a contentious issue, but it shouldn't be. I mean, this is something that's accepted by the mainstream Jewish community worldwide. Should be chapter closed. This is the definition.
But doesn't, Rabbi, doesn't the, if the Jews, look, I think it's a good definition, but doesn't it open the door to every, for Blacks, say, to make up their own definition, and it has to be on their terms. It's how they understand the way they are hated. LGBTQ can have their own official definition. Islamophobia will become its own definition, and no matter how much people protest and say you can't define hatred of an idea or a religion, it has to be about people. I have this feeling that if they get their own definition, it will include hatred or apparent disdain for whatever, for Islam. They'll get that in there, and they'll say, look, the Jews made up their own definition, and we approved it. Everybody approved it. We want ours. And I should think that any minority could do the same. I'm sure that the trans activists would love to make up a definition in which they said that hatred of trans people is expressed when people deny that a trans woman is literally a woman. If they deny that, that is hatred.
Or if they are already doing that, they're calling us TERFs.
Yeah, they are, but they don't have
They-
international recognition for it. They don't
Well,
have official
it's growing
governmental.
though.
Well, but
It's
there's a big
growing.
difference. IRA has official governmental approval.
Barbara, I would counter that. That's actually, whether it's in writing or not, that's actually happening.
It is, but if
most of
it's
the
in
groups that you
writing,
mentioned have already defined what is hatred towards them, and the world in general has accepted that that's the case, and that the people who are
I know, but I can
defining-
still say on Twitter, it's not official. I can still say on Twitter, I reject this definition. If it's, once it becomes official and it's then considered hate speech to say, no, a trans woman cannot literally become a woman, Once that's official, I can then be charged with hate speech. This is very crucial. These matters of once, official or not official, these are matters to be taken extremely seriously, in the same way that people don't understand that Israel's legitimacy as a nation does not depend on whether some bunch of crazies at a university waving their flags and screaming from the river to the sea. It depends on international law. It depends on the San Remo conference and the mandate and the this and the that and the UN vote. All these things are what give actual legitimacy to nations and to ideas. So once you have something in your charter or your constitution, well, this is very important. It doesn't matter if every school and school board is on board with you're a transphobe because. It doesn't matter what they say, because I can still say that's your belief system, it isn't mine. But once it's official, once it's actually in the criminal code, then we have a problem. We have a serious problem with freedom of speech. We have a problem with our ability to push back against retrograde or unfair or dangerous ideas, like the idea that it is hate speech to criticize Islam, or the idea that it is hate speech to criticize radical gender ideology or to criticize critical race theory, which could be, by the way, if Black people said, we want our own definition, and it's going to include that if you deny, the importance of significance of critical race theory and its correctness, then you are expressing hatred. I really worry about Pandora's boxes, and I worry about the good intentions paving company coming along, with their wonderful intentions to improve the human race and ending up,
I should have a good, very close reading of IRA once again, but I don't know that it is as susceptible to subjective manipulation or a subjective replication of the kind that you mentioned, Barbara. It's when you get into areas of ideas, and there's a lot of really bad ideas around out there. I mean, the strange magnification of the word hate and hatred. It's like hatred gets a lot of bad press. I don't know. I mean, I hate Nazis.
Well, people
Is there
have to
something
be
wrong with that?
people
what
have
I
to be
mean?
allowed to hate.
It's just there is a slippery slope, I think, that we have to be careful about. But I do think that the kind of it's the rabbi might help me with this. It's an epistemic or epistemological issue that we're dealing with here to a great extent, in that Jew hatred, anti-Semitism can be objectively identified and defined. I don't think objectively that this thing called transphobia will withstand any rational scrutiny.
Rational, it might not. Yeah, I agree. It might not. It won't withstand rational scrutiny. But it's not rational to begin with. You can't argue somebody out of something. You can't reason somebody out of something they weren't reasoned into in the first place. This is not a rational theory. It's not a rational ideology, but it is a very passionate one.
Well, maybe you and I are both coming from different places and arriving at the same juncture.
Probably.
The place I come from, and I regret to say this, is that anti-Semitism is ineradicable.
It
seems to be ineradicable.
I agree with you.
But what do?
We keep
You can't just
pursuing, and
stop.
we keep pushing, we keep the pressure up, and we don't give up. That's what we
Well,
do.
I think the main thing that you do, look, the main objective, you can't stop people from hating, and we shouldn't try to stop people from hating. Let people hate. What you want to stop doing is having it infiltrate our institutions in a systemic way, so that, for example, school boards can harass. I wrote about this last year. A perfectly wonderful school board member who was Jewish and who was hounded off her school board in a very, very horrible kind of mobbing thing. And it became very evident from the evidence that I saw, transcripts, that it was absolutely because she was Jewish. And because they associated her with Israel, and they made it very clear that anybody who had been to Israel or loved Israel or whatever was persona non grata, and should not be allowed to be on a school board kind of thing. That's where you have to focus the energy, and that's where political action has to back you up. The Ford government has seen examples in many school boards in Ontario. This is a very hot issue, and it's a very real issue. And they've been reluctant to get involved, and they say they're getting involved. This absolutely requires very robust and muscular political action. So that's where the energy has to go, not in and obviously you can't have people like Laith Marouf, getting funding and all that jazz. But you're right, Terry. It's not going away, but at least you got to keep it out of the levels of authority. You've got to stop institutions from being captured by an ideology that accepts as one of its premises that Zionism is racism, not only racism, but anybody that espouses Zion, anyone that is friendly to Israel or is persona non grata in their institution, like that McGill student union person who was not, they tried to get her kicked off. She was elected, and then they tried to get her kicked off because she was pro-Israel. That sort of thing has to be fought tooth and nail. And that's where you have to get, big donors stepping in saying, I won't fund it. I won't give my money to an institution that doesn't. So that's where the energy has to go, not in, well, you see, it says here in the definition, and look, there's that street guy and he's screaming all that stuff and it goes against the definition. I agree. Al-Quds Day is disgusting. It shouldn't happen. But you don't need the definition to know what's going on there. And if it were any other religion but Islam, I'm sorry to say, our government is extremely is on tiptoes with Islam, and not. They're very, very careful about annoying or incurring negativity from the Muslim community. And that's a sad fact, but that's the way it is.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to say that I'm going to reiterate that lefty Jewish parents are part of the problem.
Oh, yeah.
Huge part of the
Big
problem.
time.
And the school boards. So, from the standpoint of gender ideology or anti-Semitism or critical race theory, first of all, they're not tuned in. They think it's all okay. They think they're being progressive. Nobody stands up for what's right. And very few media, if any, are covering what's going on in the school boards. I took that up as a mission when I joined True North, because I could see the rise in anti-Semitism. I could see the pervasiveness of critical race theory. And I dare say education directors who are leading boards who I think don't like Jews. And one of them is at the Toronto School Board. I think another is at the Waterloo School Board. If parents don't recognize the problem and they don't speak up and they don't fight back and don't make themselves aware of what's going on, how do you handle it? How do you deal with it?
Well, I can tell you that I agree 100% there. We need more involvement from the parents. We need more pushback from the parents. There are teachers that get involved in school board issues of what they see as anti-Semitism, as discriminatory behavior towards Jewish staff members, students. And when teachers get involved, they get identified as speaking out against their employers, and they're subject to punitive issues, and it becomes a whole rigmarole. So because of, and I guess it, in a sense, it goes back to policies and procedures. There needs to be policies and procedures in place that prevent this sort of action taking place in the school boards, and that's going to come from the trustees. And the trustees are only going to listen to the parents when they speak out enough to realize that they need to protect their positions.
I'm going to give you another example, Barb. I think you were talking about Alexander Luka. from the Toronto School Board.
No, I was
Um,
actually talking about Carol Paikin Miller.
Okay, so
Um,
Alexander Luka is another person from the Toronto School Board who was singled out for being Jewish. And at the meeting where they were going to decide her fate, the chairman is wearing a keffiyeh around his neck. He sat there in the meeting with a keffiyeh.
That's
Many,
disgusting.
many people were tuning in, including, I'm sure, a lot of Jewish people who supported. I'm the only one who wrote about it and pointed it out. And, you know, and then of course he tried to defend it, that it was just a scarf that he was wearing. He was
Oh,
cold.
please. Oh, please. Jeez. You know what we
Okay.
need more of? I'll tell you, Honest Reporting does a phenomenal job.
Do they
And
do?
Yeah.
and what there's another one that started in the UK that the UK it's called UK Media Watch. They get results. They're very dogged and they just don't leave it alone. And we also need lawfare, a lot more lawsuits. The Lawfare Project does a phenomenal job. They sue universities. They sue and they have phenomenal lawyers. They have a terrific track record. You know, when it starts to cost people money, when school boards have to start paying out because they've defamed somebody and you've got an organization behind you that's happy to, you know, they'll be more careful. I think you just have to get more aggressive and very robust about it. You can't I wouldn't count on parents to do much. Parents are they're very afraid of sticking their heads over the parapet. It takes a lot. Although in the United States, you're seeing tremendous amount of pushback against critical race theory, against radical gender ideology. You know, once you get to a tipping point where people have just kind of had enough, but in the States, they're used to that. And also, I mean, they have a tradition of that, of you know, individuals getting up at ranting at school boards and that kind of thing. That's a very American kind of thing. I hope it gets catchy and it starts happening more here because you know,
Right.
As a matter of fact,
one courageous parent can actually turn. People wait for that one person, that one courageous person to stand up sometimes, and then they'll say, "Yeah, he's right," you know, and then 10 more people say, "Yeah, he's right," you know, like
Mhm.
you need more of
yeah,
that.
that's like the sheep following the
Yeah,
leader. But you know, it's interesting that Barb brought that up because we're actually working together, sort of a fledgling group. Because in the States, they formed this group called Moms for Liberty. I actually went to one of their meetings when I was down in Florida, and they are working really hard. And the one thing in this particular county in Florida, it was Vero County, near Vero Beach. They got this book out of the school that was this horrible, horrible book on Anne Frank. It had caricatures of Anne Frank, with Anne Frank sitting in an electric chair and then dancing with showgirls because she had lost so much weight she could dance with show. I mean, it was obscene.
oh
And I took
no.
pictures of it. Yes. And so, but of course, the the left-wing media, the Ron DeSantis hating media, characterize it as book banning, akin to book burning, but they never really talk about what books are being shoved out of the schools.
I should mention, Barbara, you mentioned about how we need, you know, a movement, how we need to get things going, how we need that sort of spark to proceed. And as Lisa mentioned in the chat, there are people, individuals involved, a number of us involved in bringing End Jew Hatred movement to Canada in a strong way. The work that they're doing in the States through in connection with the Lawfare Project is tremendous. And I know Lisa's doing work with that in Ottawa, and Andrea, Anita, myself, we're all supporting End Jew Hatred here in the Greater Toronto area. And as a matter of fact, the Lawfare Project is actually a participant in the Stronger Together conference. So we are definitely recognizing the fact that we need to provide means for people to learn how to start a movement, to learn how to mobilize. And that's part of the focus of our conference, is learning how to mobilize, learning how to create and begin a movement that will get people involved and connected to the issue of Jew hatred and somebody made a comment in the chat and saying we should not really be calling it anti-Semitism. It should be more aptly and accurately called Jew hatred, and I agree 100%. But it's going to take some time to get people to recognize that verbiage before we get there. We have about 19 minutes. I don't mean to cut anyone short. I love the fact that this conversation is very involved. And I think that these are important issues that we need to address. But I'm going to turn it over to Anita. She's going to moderate some questions from the Q&A so that we have a chance, at least in the last 20 minutes, to address a couple of questions.
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating active discussion so far. So I want to pick up on a couple of the questions from our large audience here, actually, and they've been very active too, around your roles as journalists. You've all had a history of proving that you're brave, that you've used your voice and your positions to speak out. How brave have you had to be? How brave have you been in your positions to speak out? How much pushback are you getting from your editorial supervisors? And I know you're in friendlier media than some, but you must be facing some pushback.
Well, I could say that at the National Post, I'm very lucky. National Post is Israel friendly, which is probably the only mainstream media I can think of in Canada that is actually not just neutral, but even, encouraging. So talking about Israel is not a problem for me. On certain other issues, it's sometimes you have to tone and discourse is very important. I've been very lucky, and people use the word brave, by the way. I would say that somebody like Sue-Ann is braver than I am, and so is Terry, because Sue-Ann actually gets out into the street and gets called names. I sit in my study and I read reports of of what other people are saying. And Terry has stuck his neck out. He did last year, did a fantastic piece for the National Post on pushing back against the Indigenous narrative of genocide and the unmarked graves affair, which was a very delicate issue. And the National Post gave him full scope to, I'll let him speak for himself, but I was so impressed with what he did, because I think that was brave. What I consider brave is journalists that get the, rocks through the windows, or they hear a knock at the door at 4 a.m. and it's the state. The state is coming to collect them for what they're saying. So I don't think what I do is brave at all. I get, nasty remarks on Twitter that doesn't really harsh my mellow most days. But that's the worst that's ever happened to me. So I reserve that word brave and courageous for more intrepid journalists than myself.
Yeah, I don't
I
think I'm particularly brave. It gets a little dodgy sometimes, like that. You're definitely right, Barbara. Like that whole year of the Graves thing was just, what the hell was that about? My God. To find oneself the subject of such vitriol and lies. I was unaccustomed to that, because I have been, kind of on the front lines of those issues before, but it's always like white rednecks who are beating the crap out of me for, writing about Aboriginal fishing rights or Aboriginal land title issues and stuff like that. And one of the things that was, and we've discussed this, is that the number of Indigenous leaders and journalists who reached out to me and said, you hang in there, you hang in there, do what you can do. I still think it's going to take a while before Canadians really realize what happened in 2 years ago, this state-sponsored mass incitement of hysteria that resulted in the vandalization and the arson and in many cases burning to the ground 74 different churches across the country. But on the whole issue of anti-Semitism in Israel, I have to say, it has been a little bit spooky, because when I started writing about Samadoun, you know, there was a petition that went around that hundreds of people signed, from South Africa to Venezuela to Europe, Britain, across Canada and the United States, identifying me as being at the center of a Zionist plot.
Really?
Yeah, to say uncharitable things about the Palestinian resistance movement or something. And you know, that was, you know, it gets a little spooky, but you know, I'm a big boy, so I don't think, it's very rare is the occasion that journalists in Canada need to be very brave. We got it pretty easy here.
It's just a question of which outlet is going to let you be as outspoken as you want. You know, and that's an issue, because the mainstream media, fortunately, outlets like True North and other non-mainstream, you know, that are not funded by the government and that can say what
Mhm.
they want within, you know, legal bounds, have been growing in strength. I know that True North has is actually growing. It's turning a profit, I think, and that's all to the good. So and you know, Substacks. This is the greatest thing that ever happened to journalists. Is
It's
the
also
freedom.
the worst thing that ever happened to us.
You
at
think
the
it's the
same
worst?
time.
I think
At
it.
the
I mean,
same time.
all I can say is I follow your Substack, Terry, is one of the greatest of
Well, thank
all.
you.
I adore it. I love it. But I mean, I'm reading Substacks of such worth, of such intelligence, of such, and if I could spend the whole day reading them. I have a very partial list because you only have so much time, but it's beautiful. Like when Barry Weiss from the New York Times, senior
Yeah,
editor,
she
and
interviewed
she
me.
was
We had a lot of fun.
she felt impelled to leave because of the anti-Semitism in her own newsroom, that, and it was her seniors, her superiors did nothing about it. She had the courage to walk away, start her own Substack with just her and her wife and her, you know, a pal or two. And now I think I don't know, 15 or 20 employees. She's
Yeah,
making
it's
money hand
amazing.
over
Yeah.
fist. More power to her. It's the Free Press, fantastic Substack. And other Jewish Substacks, Daniel Gordis. I encourage people to tune into these. Read the Elders of Zion, read
Yeah,
Israeli.
he's great.
There's fantastic online.
I just, by that I meant, when I said, you know, Substack is also the worst thing, what I meant was that there's a kind of an atomization, I think is the term that's happening now.
Well, yeah.
You know, like the statistics, something like 150 newsrooms have disappeared from this country over the
Wow.
last 10
Yeah.
years. And it's all, you know, about technology, really. But there is a terrible breakdown in the means by which Western society has arrived at a consensus about what the truth is. That's vanishing. That's disappearing. It's disappearing, obviously, from the academy. The traditions of peer review, verification, falsification, fact checking, all those old conventions of journalism are going by the wayside. And it's a very, very difficult period in which we're living, where the way I put it is, it's not just that the facts don't matter anymore. It doesn't matter that the facts don't matter anymore. It's a very, very difficult moment in epistemology.
Yes.
And how we evaluate truth claims. It's that's what I meant. But I like
100%. It is a really difficult time in journalism, and I've seen a decline even in the paper I worked for 31 years. And the Toronto Sun was very, very open. You know, they kind of gave me a lot of pushback and other things like politics, but they're very open about my coverage of anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Semitic people. I got full support on the food vendor story, and I was even sued by a crazy flag waving person who hit me at a protest, who I called anti-Semitic. I was even sued, and they put all of their lawyerly resources behind. It was Stephen Ellis, who's infamous for trying to muzzle journalists who write about anti-Semitism. got all the way to the court case. We almost got to trial, and then he, of course, backed out. So after the Sun had spent all its resources getting me prepared for trial, but I got sued for defamation because this crazy woman who's a Jew hater and an Israeli hater hit me over the head with a Palestinian flag, and then I said she was doing that because she was anti-Semitic, and I didn't even write about it. I posted on Facebook. So here you go. You have to be really careful about what you do in any social media. But that's what they do. And look, Barb, you recognize that I've been out in the trenches and I faced a lot of pushback, petitions written about me. I had 2 lesbian Jewish girls attack me on Nathan Phillips Squares once, saying I'm a disgrace to the lesbian community, not the Jewish community, but the lesbian.
Why?
Because I support Israel, and
Oh, of
that's what it was
course.
all about.
Yeah,
It was all
you gotta
about. I
order
wasn't.
from the Chinese menu. If you're on the
I
left,
wasn't.
yeah,
wasn't
you gotta
radical
tick
enough.
every box.
Yeah.
So,
But I take it in stride because I've always been controversial. I've also always been a hot point. I've always pushed the envelope. So but in the last couple of years of my career, it got pretty bad. I was harassed. I was stalked. I had these petitions written about me on social media. The labor unions and the teachers unions are really notorious for doing this sort of thing, and attack your integrity, that kind of thing. What happened with food vendors, Javier Davila got a free ride, but it never stopped me. And I'll just say one more thing. I went to a protest in the middle of COVID. I was wearing a mask and dark glasses, and it was a Jew-hating protest. This is the double standard. They were parked at the corner of Yonge and Bloor, took up the whole intersection for 3 hours, screaming about Israel. Lots of cops. They recognized me even with the mask and the glasses on. And some woman tried to get me thrown out, said the public area. It was a street corner. It was an intersection. She went to the cops and said I didn't belong there. And the cops said, well, she has every right to be there. So thank goodness in that case, the Toronto police came through. But these people they just do not quit. They do not quit. They just, they'll harass you. They'll come after you. I've been singled out. Another really, really notorious person is Dimitri Lascaris. He ran for the head of the Green Party, anti-Semitic as anything, represented Al-Quds. He singled me out at protests. He came to City Hall and called me a member of the Jewish lobby. That's what they do. But I'm not easily intimidated. So
And what about the NDP, Sue-Ann? The NDP has a lot of
NDP are,
Jews.
yeah, and the NDP are even worse. I mean, I didn't really want to talk about politics, but that's the thing that scares me about Olivia Chow as mayor, because she's got a lot of people surrounding her who are Jew haters. I'm going to say it the way I see it. They are Jew haters. Ozma Malik is one example. That woman, got into office. We have a very left-wing council, a very left-wing school board. They get into office, they hide their radical views, but then when you find out, they're already in office.
well, I can say that I admire all 3 of you for your bravery. I don't know how you characterize it, but our audience here, I think, will agree with me. Maybe in the last couple of minutes, let's just look at solutions a bit. And there's so many questions here, and you've covered a lot of it in different contexts. But so what are we going to do about it? Well, a couple of the questions are, where do you think we are in the trend? Are we still climbing? I've seen comments tonight as shades of 1930s. If that's the case, and if you agree with that, what are the solutions? I remember reading a piece recently that Barbara Kay wrote. Was it in the National Post, where you kind of suggest maybe the only solution is is to stop being so right, and maybe it's okay to be wrong, if I'm paraphrasing, and maybe we just got to get a little more militant, maybe even take up arms and protect ourselves. And where are we in the trend, and what do you think are the solutions? And I think from Mr. Glavin's point of view, who writes a lot about the sources, do the solutions have to keep in mind where the hatred is coming from. Big question. I'll leave it to you to, in the couple minutes left, to take whatever part of that type of questions that we're getting. And let's sort of turn to some practical solutions here, considering where we are in the difficulties that we're facing as we move forward.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a real solution. I think the only thing we can do is to keep as much put spotlights on people in government that are doing bad stuff and their allies, and point them out. Look, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and if the mainstream media, many of them, or if the left-leaning ones, if the CBC won't do it, that's why we should be very grateful for social media and for Substacks, and also for the free press, which is freer in the United States, because you have more of a critical mass of people pushing back. So there's a lot more media out there that is, and they have the First Amendment, so they can say a lot more. So we should probably join forces with a lot of those. But I mean, I know that Jewish organizations already have cross-border participation. I don't think people should be aiming for a solution. I think this idea that there's this magical, Terry's right, it's not going away. Anti-Semitism is going away. The only target we should have is to contain it within bounds that we can live with, without fear that our own state apparatus is completely infected with it. It is the virus is in government circles. That is a very scary thing, and we have to keep exposing those that are infected with it. And the Laith Marouf thing was good in the sense that once it was exposed, it was a tremendous embarrassment for the government. So that's what we have to prevent.
Yeah, I agree with you, Barb, 100%. Exposure is the best antidote to this. And I think we have to target more the politicians who sit on these school boards, for example, who allow this to happen, who sit on city council and allow this to happen. And we have to be a little more targeted. And if other media don't want to talk about it, then, the problem is that not enough members of the Jewish community are speaking up. And I can't say this strongly enough.
But what are we
They
going to
have
do them,
to be
Sue Ann? We can't muscle them into, we can scream at them and saying, you're idiots. You are helping, you're giving comfort to the enemy. And they'll say, no, that's not the enemy. The enemy is like all these right-wing white supremacists, blah, blah, blah. They're very, they've been.
I know, like this.
I know. So we can't depend on them. So let's assume that's part of the problem. It is part of the problem. And by the way, this is Jewish history, isn't it? I mean, in Russia, who was the head of the Cheka? Like it was a Jew. It was, Jews thought that was the way they were going to escape particularism, was, oh, communism, what a great idea. Then we won't be burdened with this anti-Semitism anymore. Everybody throughout Jewish history, there have been Jews that they were looking for that magic bullet so that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. And our left-wing Jews today think, if they appease and if they're part of, then they'll be eaten last on the, back of the crocodile. I don't know, whatever it is. You can't depend on them. So the ones of us that are woke to what's really happening, we have to carry more of a burden, and we'll just, forget about them. We just have to do our thing and keep moving along. And besides, we've got some great allies like Terry O'Glavin from
I think
a good Irish boy from
who describes himself, I believe, as an accidental Zionist, if I read.
Somebody called me that and it stuck. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that. I'll take it.
Perhaps maybe you can reflect. I know you've looked at influences from Iran, from Russia, from the terrorist wings of organizations. What's the solution there? Do you agree it's a spotlight? And then I am afraid we'll have to turn it back to Rabbi Margot to bring us to a close. So, Terry.
I think the main thing, far be it for me to tell the Jews how to deal with this issue of anti-Semitism, but I do think very strongly that you cannot let these people get away with this stuff.
Mhm.
I'm thinking now of this past beginning of Ramadan, this year and last. We had cabinet minister after cabinet minister after Liberal MP after Liberal MP expressing shock and outrage about how the Jews were storming Al-Aqsa. It was, you know, it was the recapitulation of a lie that goes back to the Mufti Hosseini and pogroms throughout the Holy Land. And every year it seems to be the same thing. Hamas say, oh, the Jews are storming Al-Aqsa. And, you know, there'll be a bunch of young toughs and they'll go up there and they'll get rocks and bricks. And then the Israelis will go in and maybe the cops will be a little bit too fierce and rough when they're getting them the hell out of there. And then there's the, you know, cabinet ministers basically regurgitating. It's like, okay, what are you doing in Jerusalem, Terry? Oh, I'm going to go to the Dublin pub down on Ben Yehuda Street, and then I'm going to go storm Al-Aqsa. I mean, it's just like, is this all that ever happens in Israel? It's you can't let these people get away with this stuff. They have to be called on it. You have to demand apologies from them. Don't let up. Don't forgive. Don't let them get away with this. I mean, this is maybe the Irish talking, but that's kind of my thinking.
We could use some of that. We could use some of
Some of the
Amen.
luck of them. Thank
Amen.
you.
I agree.
I turn it back to Rabbi now to bring us to a close, and I just express my thank you for all you're doing and keep that light shining. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you, Anita.
Rabbi.
I want to thank you all. I want to thank all three of our panelists, Terry, Sue-Ann, Barbara. We very much appreciate your being here. And I know that the three of you all said that you wouldn't describe what you do as courageous. We would most definitely describe it as such. Standing up in the face of any form of hatred and discrimination, and in particular Jew hatred, is most definitely courageous. And we hope that you'll continue to serve and as an example to others of what we should be doing in the face of what we feel is wrongdoing and injustice. I want to remind everyone once more of the Stronger Together Fighting to End Jew Hatred Conference taking place September 10th in Thornhill, Ontario. Again, it is strongertogether.co.il. You can go to the website, you can purchase tickets there, and register, and we will be most happy to see you. Where many of these topics that were brought up tonight will be discussed and more. So hopefully we will see you there. As for the questions we didn't get to, we will make an attempt to get some answers and get those to you. But once again, we thank you all for joining us and have a fantastic night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.